So I will talk to you about neural basis of consciousness. I've been passionate about consciousness for more than 3 decades for several reasons. One is, once you think about it, you quickly realize that the only way you access the external world is through your consciousness. So everything you know, everything you hear, everything you know going on in your own body or in the outside world, you only know thanks to consciousness, thanks to seeing, hearing, touching, etc. So as many people, and Erwin Schrödinger has written quite eloquently about this, phenomenology, in other words, the way the world appears to us comes prior to any conscious experience. And so science has to be able to understand this central fact of my existence, which is really also the only way I know I exist, which of course is the Cartesian insight, cogito ergo sum, I'm conscious, therefore I am. So I'll give you 2 examples of conscious experiences I've had. One I've had recently, it's made me even more interested in the topic of consciousness at the beginning of the pandemic. So this was my experience, a blazing point of pure white light of unbearable intensity, without the conceivability of looking away, as there's no away from, there's no space. Everything is contained in a point of pure energy. There are no other visuals, no color, no motion, no texture, no depth, neither sound nor silence, neither pleasure nor pain, no feeling of a body, no self, no ego, no memories, no desire, neither hope nor fear. No sensation of the experience being too brief or too long, of wanting it to end. There is no time. There's only terror and ecstasy, that and the icy bright light. So this is what people call referred to as a near-death experience. It's a rare experience and it's quite transformative. Most people who have them, they report them among the 1 or 2 or 3 most meaningful experiences of their life, and certainly being the case for me, and it induces changes in the way you perceive the world. But the point I want to make here today, it is one out of countless experiences. And this, for example, is another experience I had recently running. This is more a typical experience. So my calf muscles burn with fatigue. I will my body to continue to run along the forest trail. Looking ahead to avoid roots and rocks, I hear the caw-caw screech of crows in the canopy above me, while thinking about a work-related dispute, but come to an abrupt halt to admire the breathtaking beauty of a beam of the rising sun slipping through the dark forest and striking a moss-covered tree, reminding me of a famous poet by Wang Wei. So here you have sort of the full-blown stream of consciousness that we experience when we ride, when we work, when we go through the world, sitting in a bus, whatever. It's the Janesian stream of consciousness. It comes hand in hand with perception, visual, tactile, auditory, with thoughts, with imagery, with memories, and with future planning. And much of our life is taken up by this constant stream that really only comes to stop when you go to sleep and when you lose consciousness, or when you otherwise lose consciousness, for instance, during surgery, during anesthesia. And so what's common to both is they feel like something. That's really what consciousness is. It feels like something to be in a state of terror and ecstasy. It feels like something to be, to have this stream of consciousness. Okay, and so I sort of adopt as a working definition Francis Crick, the person with whom I worked on this for 14 years. His idea always said, well, let's have some working definition. Let's not be too rigid about it, because in the fullness of time we may have to change what we're studying, but let's adopt this as a working definition. And Thomas Nagel, an American philosopher, says it feels like something. So to be in love, or to see something, or to have a toothache, it feels like something to be in love, to see something, or to have a toothache. And that is what really the heart of consciousness is, not the behavior that's associated. In fact, I believe, and some experiments can show, you can dissociate consciousness from many things. So consciousness is not behavior, it's not intelligence. I know Tommy asked this question at the beginning of his lecture. Consciousness, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. It's not about planning. It's not about, those are all things that are associated with conscious experiences, but you can dissociate them also. When you just have a pure toothache, you're not doing a lot of moral or ethical reasoning. You may not do social cognition. You may not involve your working memory. And in fact, in a near-death experience, there isn't any evidence that you're computing anything, yet you're highly conscious. So consciousness is none of those things, although they may often be associated with them. Now, so studying this since 200 years, we know a lot about consciousness. We know consciousness is associated with certain complex adaptive biological networks, not all of them, not your heart, as most people in most cultures used to think until 300 years ago. And we still have that cardiac-laden imagery, right? We still say, I love you with my heart. Well, you should say, I love you with my hypothalamus, or if it's more rarefied, with my prefrontal cortex. It's not associated with the immune system. It's not associated with the enteric nervous system, 100 million neurons in your gut. It doesn't require behavior. When you are asleep, you wake up often. In fact, almost everyone wakes up during night in their sleeping body and has experiences. We call those dreams. They're very vivid. In fact, they can be as vivid as life itself. And inside a dream, you typically do not know that you're dreaming, that what you experience is this hallucination. It feels like life itself. And of course, there are clinical conditions when people, for instance, are in a state of catatonia where they're unable to move, and yet they're highly conscious. Conscious doesn't require emotions, as a visit to any clinic can demonstrate. We know from the last 20 years of experiments by psychologists that you can selectively attend to things without seeing them. I hold also that you can be conscious of things without attending them, but that remains a more controversial proposition. We know consciousness doesn't require language. Of course, we have it. By we, I mean adults, typically highly literary people, but a child or pre-linguistic competent baby or child is conscious and of course doesn't speak yet. A patient may lose consciousness due to stroke and may lose the ability to speak, but is still conscious. And of course, all the animal world cannot speak, yet all the evidence indicate that they too experience the sounds and sights of life. Same thing with self-consciousness. We know again from the clinic, consciousness doesn't require long-term memory. You can have patients that have lost access to any long-term memory, any explicit long-term memory, yet are highly conscious. And we know from split brain experiment that consciousness can occur in one cerebral hemisphere. Typically, the left one will speak about it, but the right one can be conscious as well. And furthermore, we know from 150 years of functional clinical neurology, like Oliver Sacks, if you've ever read him, he writes quite beautiful and compelling about this, that loss of specific cortical region goes hand in hand with loss of specific conscious content. i.e., if you lose a particular part of your visual brain, you might be unable to see color, although there's nothing wrong with your eyes, with your receptors. Or you may be unable to see motion. You may be unable to recognize the familiarity. You may believe that you're dead because you get no feelings whatsoever from, you get no feedback from your body because you have a lesion in somatosensory cortex, etc. So there's something, content of consciousness seems to be mediated by specific regions, particularly in cortex. So many years ago, when I was younger and when Francis Crick was still alive, we defined what's called the neuronal correlates of consciousness, abbreviated usually as NCC, which are the minimal neuronal mechanisms that are jointly sufficient for any one conscious percept. So those two percepts I described you earlier, they will have some NCC, some mechanism in the brain. We think it's probably neurons, a large ensemble of neurons. We don't know how large. They could be as small as 1,000 or maybe 10 million. We don't know. That are going to be jointly sufficient to explain, to give rise or to be associated with these conscious experiences. And you can ask, where are these neural NCCs? Are they a particular type of neurons? Is it a particular cell type located in a specific layer of the brain? Do they oscillate at 40 hertz? Are they synchronized? Do they express a particular receptor genes? These are all hypotheses that people have entertained. And furthermore, if you induce this NCC using, for example, the neurosurgeon's electrode or optogenetics or TMS or some other future technology, you will get the associated percept. Furthermore, if you inactivate the NCC transiently or permanently, you will eliminate the percept. Although the stimulus may still be present, you simply might not experience it anymore. So it's a causal notion of the NCC. So typically, this is how you measure it. This is one out of many ways you can measure it. It's called the contrastive method. So you briefly flash up a stimulus, and I ask you, what do you see? Right now, I have no control over the Zoom on the internet, what you actually saw, but what there was present, was this, for let's see, 30 milliseconds, I flash up this very noisy image of a face. And, depending on who you are, I can adjust the timing and how young you are and where you look and all sorts of other things. I can adjust the timing so that half the time you will see, let's see, a face, and you push a button face, and half the time you just see some noisy, unrecognizable pattern. You still see something, but you don't see a face. And so I can collect all the times you see a face when you press yes, and compare that against the neural activity when you don't see a face. And then, I get activity, and I can subtract that, and I can now say, well, these spots, these hot spots here, can you see my cursor?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, these hot spots are possible footprints of the conscious perception of seeing a face, right? Because that's what I'm contrasting here. In fMRI, I can do the same in EG, I can do the same in a monkey, or we are doing it here at the mouse. We're just finishing a paper where we've done something like that in the mouse. You always have the same physical stimulus, but sometimes you see it and sometimes you don't. And now in principle, you can track, well, where are these? So for example, here you get these hotspots in prefrontal cortex, medial prefrontal cortex, you get the fusiform gyrus, and you get sort of extrastriate cortex. Well, now, of course, you have to control for all sorts of things. So here you are pressing one button on one hand, maybe in here you're pressing the other button on the other hand. So you have to make sure that isn't a confound. You have to make sure you're not looking at attention, because maybe here you're attending more than here. You have to make sure that this is not a task dependency. And because here you're carrying out a task, you're memorizing, okay, when I see a face, I have to push this. This is my task. It turns out that consumes, although it seems trivial, that consumes considerable neuronal resources. In fact, most of this activity up front here will go away when you do a no-task paradigm. So when you don't ask people to do anything, you just show stimuli to people. They can still see them, of course, yet you don't ask them to push a button. The activity in the back pretty much stays undiminished. The activity here in the front goes away mainly. The so-called no-report paradigm. There are other paradigms. You can also compare just being quietly awake, like a resting state. You're just lying in the magnet, your eyes are closed, you're not asleep, versus being, for example, in deep sleep, or being versus anesthesia or something, right? So you can look at the difference between the conscious state to pure, the entire conscious state and the unconscious state. And again, there you have to, the other confounders you have to worry about. So people try these different paradigms in people, in normal people, in patients, in non-human primates, and now also in rodents. So it's very important to distinguish these NCCs, these are minimal jointly sufficient, from what Francis Crick and I call background or enabling conditions. You see, we know many things in your body have to go on in order for you to be conscious. Most importantly, your heart has to beat. We know if your heart doesn't beat, or if your heart beats, but we cut off, for example, somebody chokes you, right, the carotid artery, we know within 8 seconds, you will, quote, lose consciousness. You faint. It's a protective response of the brain, because the brain proper has no energy, has no power backup, there are no batteries there. And so if you cut off the blood supply, the brain goes into shutdown mode and you faint. So we know the heart has to pump, but we know the heart is just a background condition. The heart itself doesn't give rise to any conscious sensation. We know this, for example, from transplant. You can be recipient of a donor heart from somebody else, and you will still be you. Likewise, there's a whole plethora of mechanism in your brainstem. So your brainstem is roughly 2 inches It's like a garden hose, 2 inches of garden hose, roughly 1 inch thick. It goes from at the bottom from the spinal cord, turns into the medulla, the pons and the midbrain, the inferior and superior colliculus. These neurons, here's a whole set of different neurons called the reticular formation. We know this is some work done by Joseph Parisi and Antonio Damasio. This is a set of roughly 40 different set of neurons distributed in the 3-dimensional space that share common cytoarchitectonic and other, they express similar genes. They are responsible for modulating, let's say, your thermal normalization, for breathing, temperature, satiety, hunger, thirst, all those things, arousal, attention, all those things are mediated by various neurons here. For example, noradrenergic, serotonergic neurons, etc., are located here, and you need those in order to be conscious or even to be awake. We know again from patients, if you have an intact cortex or cortex thalamus, but you have lesions, particularly if they're bilateral lesions, even if they're small lesion in the brainstem, you're typically either dead or in coma. If it's unilateral, you might be depending where. For example, you could be in a locked-in state where you're completely locked in, depending on where the location of the lesion is. Yet, because you have cortex still functioning, you are fully conscious. So we know they're necessary, but they don't give rise to the actual content, the actual feelings. At least in typical people who grow up with cortex. It's different if you talk about children who never had never cortex, like an anencephalic infant. But in all of us neurotypical, cortex provides the content of consciousness. The brainstem provides the background conditions that it's necessary for cortex to give rise to activity that ultimately gives rise to feelings. All right, so you can now look at different structures. Spinal cord, 18-inch long, roughly an inch wide, 18-inch long, 200,000, 300,000 neurons, contains, of course, all your motor and sensory pathways. If it's damaged or crushed, like in Christopher Reeve's, the Superman actor, often you have to be ventilated, you're unable to move, yet you're still highly conscious. So, I mean, people knew about this already in the 19th century and decided, well, okay, whatever else the spinal cord does, it doesn't seem to give rise to consciousness. Now, as a physicist, you can ask, well, there are neurons there. Why, you can just ask, they're neurons, they have action potential, they have input and output. Why don't they give rise to consciousness? Somehow that architecture or that stuff in the spinal cord doesn't give rise to consciousness. More relevant maybe to us, there is the cerebellum, right? So 80% of your neurons, you have on the order of 100 billion neurons, 80% of those are found in the back of your brain, the so-called little brain, cerebellum. In some people, like this lady, she was born without a cerebellum at all, so-called cerebellar agenesis. She has all sorts of issues, but she's perfectly conscious. She can talk, but she can talk about her feelings. She certainly has feelings. There are lots of people who have lesions here because, let's say, glioblastoma or some other cancer, the surgeon has to take out parts of the cerebellum. And these people have, again, they get ataxia, they have slurred speech, unsteady gait, etc., but they never complain about loss of consciousness. Now here you have a beautiful, highly organized structure, contains some of the most beautiful and complex neurons, i.e. Purkinje cells with their fan-shaped dendritic trees. Yet if you remove them, consciousness doesn't seem to be impacted. So whatever the cerebellum does, it doesn't give rise to the feelings of life. But really cortex. The cortex, as you all know, it's a layer technology. It's I call it 2+epsilon dimensional technology that was invented by mammals 230 years ago. It's planar in a sense. So its width only changes by factor 2 or 3. In a mouse, it's 700 microns. In us, it's 2.5 millimeters. In us, it's like a pizza. In a monkey, it's a peanut butter cookie. In a mouse, it's less than a sugar cube. But some animals, like blue whales, have even bigger cortices, or elephants. And we're now discovering there's going to be a special issue of Nature coming out in 3 months from now with 12 papers, all describing in excruciating detail the different types of neurons. So people now estimate that there are on the order of 1,000 different types of neurons that constitute what we call the brain. So it's not just excitatory inhibitory, but there are hundreds of different subtypes of various excitatory and inhibitory types of neurons, and the challenge and where they project to, what input they get, their electrophysiological identity, the genes they express, the neurotransmitter they use, et cetera, et cetera. And the challenge for neuroscience is to try to make sense of all of that. Our challenge is, just at the level of brain area. So if it's cortex that's involved, and all the clinical evidence suggests that, what part of cortex? Because cortex is big, and we know it's not all of cortex. You can lose certain parts, for example, in lesion studies. So people have natural lesions studied them for 150 years due to stroke, gunshot, virus, etc. Ice picks, knives, all sorts of things. People do a stimulation. So even today, as part of functional neurology workup, neurologists and neurosurgeons routinely stimulate part of cortex. And so you can study which part of the brain, which part of cortex is just mute. In a sense, you stimulate it and the patient will report no feelings. Versus those parts where the patient stimulate and they report, oh yeah, I saw something, there was a flash of light, or I have this fear, I have this visceral fear. And every time you stimulate, the patient has this fear, or they may have a specific memory. And lastly, but weaker evidence, because it's correlation, it's not causal. Of course, we have 50 years of recording and neuroimaging, fMRI, MEG, EEG, etc. studies. And so I'm going to cut to this chase here. There's lots of data here we can go through. This, for instance, beautiful one out of Stanford. This is a bunch of 10 patients. The front of the brain is on top, visual cortex is in the back. So you're looking at them like through their feet. And you see the set of regions. So this is the brain viewed from below. So we've removed the cerebellum, we removed the tentorium. You're looking at the fusiform gyrus. So visual cortex is here and here. This is fusiform gyrus. And the color just tells you locating the face area, here using EEG. But we also know this from fMRI, Nancy Cambridge's fusiform face area. So the fusiform gyrus here is these regions that selectively respond to much stronger to faces than to non-faces. But now, because the neurosurgeons has electrodes here, you can stimulate, and you can see. So these are all the various sites of stimulation. You can see that if you stimulate the right FFA, namely this one, you cause the patient to experience changes in the way they experience faces. For example, the face of the tester, the face of the surgeon. Not if you stimulate the left fusiform face area. So shows you the importance of, that correlation isn't causation. So on the right, you can cause faces to be seen, but not on the left. All right, yeah, and so people have done much more detailed stimulation studies recently, came out in Nature Behavior last year. So it's a summary here, both from a Scientific American article, that as far as we can tell, consciousness, so the aspect of consciousness that here I'm referring to that's been best studied is visual consciousness, seeing, hearing, somatosensor, touching, and also feelings of volition. You can induce feelings of wanting, of agency in patients. Also, if you stimulate part of the interparietal lobe. And so there seems to be what we call a posterior hot zone in the back of the brain, lots of evidence, in the back of the brain, excluding the primary visual, auditory, somatosensory area, that seems to be directly relevant for giving rise to experiences. Not the front of the brain, unlike many people have argued. The front of the brain, of course, has lots of other functions, including reasoning, intelligence, etc., task carrying out, attention, task setting, task switching, etc., but doesn't seem to be involved directly in consciousness, in experience per se. And of course, you have to ask, well, where's the difference? It's all cortex. Well, they're different cell types, But most importantly, the connectivity here in the front, particularly way up front, is much more random access, while the connectivity here in the back is more like a grid of pyramids. Very different connectivity. All right, there's also EEG evidence in favor of this. All right, so we abduce consciousness in others. So here there are two female mammals. One is my daughter, the other one is a dog, Tosca. We assume, I mean, most of us will assume that both are conscious. Why? Well, their behavior is similar, it's not identical, just like if you're a sheep. My daughter now has a toddler, I'm a grandfather, and the toddler doesn't speak yet, but you know, he smiles, he does things appropriately. So there's no, we assume, of course, all that he's conscious, although he cannot directly tell us, because that's one thing that makes consciousness different from studying leptons and viruses and black holes and anything else. They have this privacy aspect. Consciousness is private to me. I have to infer that you're conscious by your behavior, by the similarity of brain architecture. We are very similar, all of us have very similar brain architecture. So if you get consciousness in my brain, why would you not get consciousness in your brain? Close evolutionary kinship, we are all closely related. So this is called, you know, it's a form of induction called abduction, inference to the best explanation. So giving all the facts I have about the world, I abduce that others are conscious, including mammals. What we have special is through language, sense of self, and of course, an overly developed sense of our own importance. For instance, here, I've done this now at the Allen Institute. I show you neurons. One of them is a human neuron pyramidal cell. The other one is a mouse pyramidal cell. I've cheated because I removed the scale bar. One is roughly 3 times taller than the other because the cortical thickness is taller. I've shown these images to my staff, 300 people at the Allen Institute, who all have lots of experience looking at these. And one after the other did tests for 12 of these pairs, and people are essentially at chance. You know, I'm not saying you couldn't train a machine learning model to distinguish human from mouse cells, but they're very, very similar. The basic hardware is very similar. We have more of it, but other creatures have even more than we do. And so the question is, given that natura non faces saltus, by basic evolutionary principle, there's continuity across all species. You know, so we are here, the mammals behind the Bernese mountain dog. These are other very creatures that have complex brains with complex behavior. So which one of them has feelings? Only these? In fact, at some point we thought only humans, not even these guys. René Descartes, for example, thought that. Or do birds that have very complicated memories, short and long-term memories, bees that have language, can recognize individuals, can return to a source of food that's a mile away on a single tile, only have 1 million neurons, however, packed in a density 10 times denser than ours. Does it feel like something to be, or does it feel like something to be a cephalopod? And what about the rest of the tree of life? All right, now I come to the second part of my talk, a theory of consciousness. Ultimately, we need to explain, so the NCC, that's a basic scientific program. It'll come to its end. I mean, it's ongoing now, lots of people are doing it. That's all good, but ultimately we want a more fundamental theory. We need to explain, particular, how does consciousness arise? Because none of our fundamental theories, quantum mechanics, general relativity, there's no consciousness there. In the periodic table of the elements, there's no consciousness. In the endless ATGC chart of our nucleotide, there's no consciousness, yet we wake up every day and have conscious experience, we see and feel. So how does it arise? How is it compatible with physics that seems to describe the rest of the world exceedingly well? So there's one particular theory that I've been involved in. I'm just going to very briefly highlight it. Many of you will have known about it, called integrated information theory, or IIT. It's due to the work of a singular psychiatrist and neuroscientist, an Italian, Giulio Tononi, who for many years now has a big lab here at University of Madison in Wisconsin. And you know, lots of papers on it. And you can go to the website. There's Python code, and there's lots of material to be found at integratedinformationtheory.org. So it's a fundamental theory. It defines what exists. So it starts with ontology. And in particular, it makes 5 axioms. It says any so it takes a little bit of transcendental approach, a la Immanuel Kant. It says any experience whatsoever, including my near-death experience, or including any experience you imagine, has 5 properties. So it's like an axiom. They exist for itself. Experience exists for itself. It doesn't require an external observer. So again, it's private. It exists intrinsically for me. I have conscious experiences. B, every experience is structured. It has many aspects. It's left and right and up and down. There are objects in it. There's a body in here. This is a famous drawing of Ernst Mach. But anything you experience have their structure in it. It's highly informative in a sense. Each experience is a specific way it is. It's highly differentiated, right? You can experience sights. Every frame of every movie is one particular experience. And then, of course, you can cause that with every taste, with every sound, with every bodily sensation. You know, it's near infinite. And each one of them is, is the specific way it is. It's integrated, it's unified. So you can't reduce an experience to independent components. So if I'm looking out here, I'm looking at the sea, Lake Washington. I might see the entire lake in front of in my plenum, in my visual field. That's not the same as saying, well, there's a left experience and a right experience, and they're stitched together. There's only one experience. Of course, I can turn my head, I can shift my attention, but for any one conscious experience, whatever I'm experiencing is holistic. It's one, it's integrated, it's unified. Can't be reduced to independent components. And lastly, probably most importantly, it's definite. It's only one in the sense, whatever I experience, when it's something vague, like driving in the fog and I see something, but I don't quite see it yet, that is the way it is. It's not that I'm seeing, plus there are other things that I'm seeing, whatever I'm conscious of, there are certain things that are in, that are contained in that experience, and there's a vast universe of possible distinctions that are not in that particular universe, in that particular experience. So it's very important because it ends up being a principle of maximum principle. Each experience is definite. All right, so for each of these 5, so there are 5 axioms. Each experience exists, is structured, is differentiated, is integrated, and is only one. There's now an associated postulate. And so these postulates require you to have a description of the system. A system can be anything that has 2 or more states. So it could be here in the simple case, because the mass is simpler, you have binary neurons. It could be dust, it could be transistors, it could be neurons, whatever you choose to look at. And you have to define some sort of transition probability matrix. And the theory asserts that finally what exists is, so in that sense, it's a fundamental theory. It starts out with existence. What exists has to have causal power. Only things that have causal power exist. This is the basic principle in physics, although it's rarely expressed that way. If you think about, gravitation, or if you think about, electromagnetism, we know it exists because it has particular causal power. It can act, it can attract or repel, right? And so, for consciousness, the theory says causal power upon the system itself. The system has to be caused by something in the past, and it has to have causal power to change its own state in the future, in the next step. The more causal power a system has, the more it exists. And this is something intrinsic. There's nothing to do with information theory, which sends information from A to B. It just says a system exists for itself. It exists to the extent that it has intrinsic causal power upon itself to make a difference and to take a difference. In other words, to have causal power from the past and causal power into the future, to make a difference and to take a difference. And the more causal power a system has, the more it is conscious. So you translate each of those 5 axioms, intrinsic existence, composition, information, integration, exclusion, into a postulate. So for example, the last postulate says exclusion. Of all the postulates, so you have some substrates, a bunch of neurons, or here these simple mechanisms. Of all the possible substrates, the only substrate that has existence is the one that maximizes this intrinsic causal power, which is called phi. The measure of that is phi. So phi is a pure number. It's either 0 or positive. It's not measured in bits. It's just a number, and tells you how irreducible a system is and how much it exists for itself, how much it is conscious. It's sort of the quantity of causal power, and in the theory that's identical with the quantity of consciousness. And it's of all the system, it's computational demanding, because you have to look at all possible subsets of the system, and only that system is the substrate of consciousness, is the one that has maximum phi. The other ones intrinsically don't exist. They exist, of course, extrinsically, but they don't exist for themselves. So that means the physical substrate of consciousness, what Koch and I call the NCC, will have definite borders. There will be some neurons that are in, or some mechanisms that are in, and the majority of mechanisms that are not in. And so how can we find that? All right, so this is all very abstract. I agree, and it's of course a run through. There are workshops now organized on this. So finally, the theory says an experience is identical. It's not proportional, it's not necessary, but it's identical. So it has a complex calculus that I didn't explain that allows you to unfold the causal power of everyone. So you take a system and you look at all of its causal power. The language that's used there, you unfold its causal power. So each system has a unique amount of causal power and a unique quality of intrinsic causal power, and that is the one that gives rise to the experience that while space is spatially extended and time flows and colors are different and are organized in a three-dimensional space. Because the challenge is not only to explain the existence of consciousness, by why certain types of consciousness feels unique. You know, space is very unique, it's extended. That's very different from time. Time isn't extended, time flows, right? There's always a past and there's a future. There's a past from which we came and there's a future into which we're going, and which is very different from taste, or very different from pain, or very different from color or any other conscious percept. And so finally, so the theory has this quantity that most people refer to because it's relatively easy to understand, phi, and then a quality. All right. And it says the central identity of IIT says any experience is identical to this maximum irreducible cause-effect structure. It's not proportional, it's identical. It's an identity where nothing is left over on either side. So all of phenomenology, every aspect of every experience you ever have has to be mapped one-to-one onto some aspect of this very high-dimensional space. And when we here talk about integrated information, it's perhaps an unfortunate misuse, because it's not information in the Shannon sense. As I said, there's no bits sent from a receiver in the brain to itself, because there isn't an observer in the brain, right? Whatever the brain does, it does it for itself, because consciousness is generated for me. It's an intrinsic thing. And so this use of information informare, to give form to, really relates to the much earlier notions of form used by Aristotle. All right, so there are all sorts of corollaries: prediction, explanation, extrapolation. I'm just going to talk a few about them. So one is the design of a conscious meter. And this is now pretty advanced, and in fact, we're trying to do a clinical study on this conscious meter. So there are many patients, thousands of them, I mean relatively many, that had either stroke, trauma, massive intoxication, or other things, encephalitis, some end-stage COVID patients that are clearly alive, but it's unclear whether they are conscious. So some patients are in coma, then it's definitely, they're not conscious. But you have this more challenging group that hover between what's called a persistent vegetative state, where people, or also called behavioral unresponsive state syndrome, where people may open their eyes for 2, 3, 4 hours. They might groan or move sort of their head or something, but they don't respond when you say, Mr. Smith, can you hear me? Can you shake your head or move your eyes left and right, or apply pressure to the hand? You have no idea whether they are or not. Those are very, very challenging to deal with. Some patients are what's called in a minimal conscious state, MCS plus or MCS minus, where sometimes you can get for some brief periods some responses. But many of these are like stranded astronauts. You don't know, are they clearly alive, but they lost their radio, and so they're unable to communicate, or is the injury so damaging that they're simply not there. So there, what IIT has done many years ago, Giulio Cenoni first in a paper in Science, and then in a bunch of other papers, now moving more towards clinical papers with Marcello Massimini in Milan, is design a technique here, I'm testing it myself, where you put a high density EEG net, let's see, 64 EEG sensors, to measure the electrical responses of cortex to a perturbation. So here it's very important that you perturb the brain. In this case, by a brief pulse of magnetic energy, so-called TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. So essentially, think of it a little bit, you have a church bell, you hit the church bell with a hammer, and then you're listening for the resonances. And you get these, so here you can see in one electrode, you can see these sort of butterfly plots. This is when I'm conscious, when I'm awake. And this lasts like, 300 milliseconds, you get this complex reverberation. The electrical wave you can see here travels around. This is the EEG. And this is using inverse modeling of the source, the underlying currents. Here you stimulate sort of somatosensory cortex, and here sort of, it propagates around. And you can now essentially compress that, and you can look at the complexity. Essentially, that's what you're doing. Normalized to between 0 and 1, where 1 is maximal complex, and 0 is essentially flat line, like a flat line EEG. And you can do this in all sorts of people, in all sorts of patients and normal people. So you can do it, for example, in non-REM sleep, when people are unconscious, when you zip and zap. It's called zip and zap because you zap using the TMS, and you zip essentially, because it's similar to the Lempel-Ziff complexity algorithm used in your zip file. This happens to be a magic number, totally random, nothing special mathematically about it, but for all people, this is the beauty of the scheme. That's why we think it will be used in the clinic. 0.31 perturbation complexity index. So if the brain complexity is below this number, just the evidence in normal people who are in deep sleep, in normal people who are under 3 different forms of anesthesia, midazolam, so that's a benzodiazepine, xenon, a rare gas, or propofol standard, it's low. If, however, you are in REM sleep, where you're dreaming, where you report a dream after I wake you up, on a ketamine, where you on which is a dissociative, right? It's not a true anesthetic; it's a dissociative. When you're awake, or when you have these patients that are locked in syndrome, LIS, where they're clearly conscious yet they're totally unable to move, maybe except their eyes, or in various other control cases, emerging minimal conscious state, where we have evidence. Again, where we have external, clinically validated evidence they're conscious. So this is now being tested in a variety of centers, in MGH, in Milan, in UCLA, Madison, South Carolina, etc., to test this in large-scale population. So that's pretty cool. The theory says you can have systems that conscious can be graded. You take the same system here on the left, where you have 5 modules of 3 neurons each. And for this one, you can compute phi explicitly, it's, let's say 10.56. So that's the irreducibility. Now you start adding noise to these long-range interconnection, and the phi max of the whole is still 3.22, is still bigger than the phi of these little modules. But if you keep on adding a noise, suddenly the whole the whole falls apart, and because the whole now, because it's sort of really, it's 5 independent conscious entity, because here their phi max 0.19 is higher than the phi of the whole. So this is this principle of maximum of, like many maximum principles in physics. This has some interesting predictions, because you can do the following. So remember split brain experiments done, first in 1948 or so, and then done by particularly by Roger Sperry at Caltech. Well, he worked with neurosurgeons who did it and got the Nobel Prize for this. So in certain cases of severe epileptic seizure, epileptic seizure can spread from, let's say, the right to the left. And what you do, you can cut the commissure. So there are 3 commissures. There's the corpus callosum, that's roughly 200 million fibers connecting the right and the left brain. Plus there's an anterior commissure and a posterior commissure. They have like, 500,000 fibers or so. And sometimes you have to cut all three. And then as far as we can tell, there are two entities, two conscious entities inside one skull. There's the left one, and the left one can typically talk. So in this case, it can tell you, yeah, I'm seeing a Bernese mountain dog. There's a right one, and as far as we know, all the evidence says they can see, they can answer simple yes, no question, but they're not eloquent. They can sing, interestingly, but they can't talk. And so in terms of integrated information theory, it says, yeah, with those 200 million fibers connecting the left and right brain, there's a single maximum of phi that extends across both cortical hemispheres. And when you cut it, well, there are two. So there's left consciousness, and it's totally independent of right consciousness. And that's what the evidence suggests. You have two conscious mind inside a single skull. Now, you can also do the opposite. So I wrote a little science fiction story with Patrick Hausen, published in Nature. You could do the opposite, it's just the inverse of split brain, where you take, let's see, my brain and somebody else's brain. So here I demonstrated it, an English speaker and a French speaker. So just think about, I connect my brain with your brain. So early on, I just have a couple of wires that go from my visual cortex to your visual cortex, and your frontal cortex to your frontal cortex, etc. And I'm still me, and you're still you, but I have access to some information in your brain now. But at some point, particularly, the theory says very clear, once the integrated information of the whole here, of both cortical, exceeds the integrated information of either the left or the right, even though by trifold, even only by 0.001, at that point abruptly, the individual existence of these individual consciousness will disappear, and there will be a single uber consciousness, an amalgamation of those two brains. So now you have, just like in a split brain patient, before you cut the brain, the corpus callosum, you have one consciousness. You cut the brain along the along the midline, you get two consciousness. Here, you unify two brains, you put them together using some information technology, you get one conscious mind, with all sorts of interesting consequences. In principle, one can start thinking about testing this in mice. All right, the theory says, very counterintuitive, particularly for computational people, you take two systems. Here, a purely feed-forward system. Here is a much simpler system that's heavily feedback. They perform exactly the same input-output function. So you can assign the same input, you get the same output, both for system A and for system B. This, because if you look under the hood, is all feed-forward, and it's integrated information 0. It has no causal power upon itself because it's all feed forward. Well, this system has some minimal conscious, it has some phi. So once again, what this theory says, it's not about input-output mapping. There's no Turing test in principle that'll tell you whether the system is conscious. You actually have to look at the structure of the system. Yeah, so the NCC are structures that maximize integrated information. This theory says that experience is very widespread in the animal kingdom, because certainly if you look at the mushroom body of a bee with 800,000 neurons, highly complex, highly integrated, it certainly will think. Now it won't worry about the weekend, it won't feel obese, but it may have simple feelings of seeing, smelling, happiness. There can be no group minds. Once you have a group mind, it comes at the cost of individuality. The theory predicts states of pure experience, even when the cortex is silent, but it's potentially could be activated. That is an experience that's probably akin to what Buddhists call pure experience. In the strict sense, experience has no function, just as electrical charge in physics has no function. Of course, evolutionary pressure leads to systems that have high integrated information, but that's an indirect mechanism. So in that sense, consciousness is like a spandrel. IT is not about input-output transformation. It's about intrinsic causal power. Yeah, so let me just end here. There's an ongoing experiment to test prediction between integrated information theory and the other global neuronal workspace, because I want to come to one last, this is the experiment. Yeah, for those of you, I know some of you come from computer science, machine learning, because it's very counterintuitive. This theory says nothing about computation. So there are two dominant theories in the scientific theory field of consciousness, IoT and global neuronal workspace. Global neuronal workspace essentially argues consciousness is a particular type of computation. And once we instantiate that computation, yeah, then that system will be conscious. IT takes a radical different point of view and says nothing to do with computation. It's nothing to do with instantiating a particular input-output function. It's all about intrinsic causal power. And the really good metaphor you can use to explain this is you can have a laptop that simulates gravity, right? You can write down Einstein's field equation. You can solve them, let's say, for the black hole at the center of the galaxy. Oh, no problem. People have done this, gotten a Nobel Prize last year for it. However, you don't have to be concerned that you're going to be sucked into your black hole computer, into your computer simulating a black hole. Because, well, if you think about it, that's the difference between the simulated and the real. The simulated simulates gravity, even that of the black hole, but doesn't have actually any real causal power to affect the space-time curvature. Same thing with consciousness. Consciousness is actually something physical. In this case, something physical having to do with causal power for a system upon itself. You can't simulate that. I mean, you can simulate the behavior. So there's no question in 10 years' time, you'll get, you know, Alexa 2.0. In fact, right now already, if you go to Google and you go to the chat box, Lambda, it's deeply impressive. I was privy to a demonstration of Lambda. It's very impressive, the range and depth and breadth of conversation you can have with Lambda. But of course, I think it's all fake consciousness. It makes beautiful input-output that you can have a conversation with it that you can't really tell apart from your average cocktail party conversation. But that's different from consciousness. If you want to get conscious in a computer, in an artificial system, you have to build it. You have to build circuits that have the causal power, just like, you know, like neuromorphic architecture. You cannot simulate it. Yeah, so you have to build it in. So all the cloud stuff, all the, you know, von Neumann machine, of course, they have a minimal amount of complex, of internal causal power, because, you know, you transfer charge onto a gate and that switches and opens the, you know, the current, the channel, etc. But it's a minimum, minute amount and doesn't depend at all on the program. You can show that formally that that causal power does not change with no matter what you program on that computer. And so I come to my last slide. In view of consciousness, and you can dissociate intelligence, consciousness. Intelligence ultimately is about doing. It's about acting in a complex world populated with complex agents that have their own agencies at a variety of spatial temporal scales, right? Over seconds, minutes, days, hours, weeks, months, years, etc., centuries, right? That's intelligence. We cherish it. So you have people like Madame Curie, you know, at the high end, and then you've got this the sea anemone at the low end. Yet that's very different from consciousness. Consciousness, in this view, is state of being. It's a state of being. It's about being. And because we have creatures evolved with natural selection from this guy to this girl rather, Homo sapiens, you know, you have a variety of, because evolutionary pressure increased our intelligence, particularly with increasing cortex, particular prefrontal cortex, but also because these circuits became more and more complex. You can show that in simulation, increased the causal power of these circuits. So thanks to evolution, we get this covariance between intelligence and consciousness. But you can certainly imagine building so-called cerebral organoids, as people are doing right now, for example, mimicking, you know, early stage, second trimester developing cortex that could have, in principle, high consciousness, including feelings, yet no intelligence because you have no input-output receptors connected to them. And likewise, according at least to IIT, you can have, you know, all sorts of highly intelligent machines, AlphaGo, AlphaFold, you know, Lambda, you know, Alexa, whatever your favorite program is, that have increasingly high intelligence, but no feelings whatsoever. So this says they're really radical different things. One is about doing, and the other one is about being. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I hope I've given you some feelings of what it is to study consciousness and how for scientific program to study the neural footprints of consciousness and the need to have a theory of consciousness that explains how it's compatible with how it arises from physics. And with that, I thank you for your attention.